First World War was not the war to end all wars, but it did set a new benchmark for human suffering. 21 million wounded, 8.5 million killed, hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed. Carnage and devastation on an undreamt-of scale. For almost a century, the Great War has nearly always been seen in black and white. But the Kahn archive in Paris holds an astonishing collection of color images of the Western Front. These pictures allow us to see the war as French soldiers themselves saw it. In mud brown, steel blue, and blood red.
I think to see First World War photographs in colour, it is remarkable. It changes the way that I, in particular, come to the First World War.
The colour allows you to touch a bit more of this fact that they are human beings, you know, that they are real people. And so real that you have the feeling that, you know, if you're going out, even today, you can meet these people.
It's extraordinary because I've never seen anything like them. They really are remarkable. The domesticity and war fighting should be crashed together in these pictures, and it's brilliant.
Kahn's photographs are an enduring testament to the sufferings of the French troops of World War I. Ordinary men fighting an extraordinary war. On the 3rd of August 1914, Germany declared war on France. A day later, thousands of German troops invaded neutral Belgium. After 2 weeks of heavy fighting, they reached France. The French had already responded to the threat. 1.5 million men had been mobilized to fight. Over the next 4 years, a further 7.5 million Frenchmen were trained and equipped for war.
The French army was a conscript army in which male French citizens, regardless of background, would expect to serve.
The French young man saw conscription as part of life. It was a natural ordering of things, almost a rite de passage of life. Every young man had an obligation to defend state and society.
At his mansion on the outskirts of Paris, the French financier Albert Kahn was in deep shock. As a committed pacifist, he was appalled by the war. But as a patriotic Frenchman, he was determined to do what he could for his country. For the previous 6 years, Kahn had been sending photographers around the world, aiming to create a photographic record of global civilization. For now, though, he would have to put this epic project on hold. Instead, he decided to throw his vast resources into documenting the French army at war.
Albert Kahn was deeply affected by the events of the war from 1914. So he immediately suggested to the Minister of War that he should send his photographers to take color photos at the front line.
Kahn pushed on an open door when he went to the army to say that he had at his disposal cameramen and the technical means of developing films and photographs for the benefit of the army. They were delighted. And together with the major distributors of cinema before the war, Louis Lumière and Gaumont, they provided a service that no other army in the world had.
Over the next 4 years, Kahn worked closely with the armed forces. His photographers were given privileged access to the war zone, and the army trained up 2 soldiers as color photographers. In return, Kahn agreed to share images with the military. Some of them were clearly intended to boost morale. Brave soldiers in the trenches, modern patrol boats, and big guns poised for action. But for the most part, these pictures are a highly distinctive record of the conflict. Kahn's photographers had documented everyday life around the world for the archives of the planet. Now they would train their cameras on everyday life in the French army.
We don't see combat, we don't see dead bodies. What we do see is the endurance and stoicism of the men who had to fight for 1,500 days. And there's a self-consciousness in the attitudes of many of the soldiers whom we can see. But that's because they realize that this is also a matter of record. This isn't just observing people getting on with their lives. It's observing people risking their lives, and people who may not come back.
In the first weeks of the war, there was little time for photography. The speed of the German advance left the French army gasping for breath. By the end of the first month, the Germans were within 8 miles of Paris, and 200,000 French troops were dead. Their tactics and their brightly colored uniforms were totally out of step with modern warfare. Both cost them dear.
The doctrine and teaching of the French army in 1914 was en avant avec le bayonet. Onwards, come on with the bayonet. And it was thought that all you had to do was to get masses of men with sufficient guts and determination and push forward. But if you wanted an indicator on the field of battle, here I am, you couldn't have a better indicator of where the French soldier actually was. Blue tunic, red trousers, brightly coloured cap. The philosophy was, the red will give you that extra fillip of courage.
They went into battle in these wildly impractical uniforms, using wildly impractical tactics, and paid a huge price for it. The first year of the war, which only involved fighting for some 5 months, is the most expensive in terms of dead of all the war years for the French army. And so those people who'd said before the war that there was something distinctively French about the red trouser were responsible for carpeting the hills of the Franco-German border with lots of dead conscripts.
Reluctantly, they swapped revolutionary red for a muted shade of blue-grey.
Bleu horizon, as they called it, was as good a colour as any. And when it got muddied a bit, it was a perfect blending. Frosty ground, pale blue or pale bluey grey is as good as khaki.
In early September 1914, the French halted the German advance at the Battle of the Marne, and the war moved into a new phase. Both sides had suffered huge casualties in open warfare. Faced with machine guns and modern artillery, the only safe place to be was underground. With a huge swathe of northern France in German hands, the opposing armies started to dig in, creating a line of trenches 750 kilometers long. The Western Front.
Trench warfare wasn't so much a universal surprise as the thing that lots of the combatants feared, because once the front went from Switzerland to the North Sea and was laced into the ground like this, the sort of quick decision that people had hoped for in 1914 was going to be years away.
For thousands of French troops, home was a muddy hole.
This photograph shows us French soldiers who've just dug what seems to be a communication trench, and I love it, in part because of the faces and in part because of that little bit of style. One of them is wearing a red cummerbund, and there he is trench digging, but it's got a little bit of Gallic bravura to him. I think what we see here are men who are used to digging and who are standing above a piece of their handiwork, and they're rightly proud of it.
Amongst their allies, however, French trenches had a very different reputation.
When British regiments took over French trenches, they were pretty horrified by the state of dirt, absence of proper latrine facilities. And that picture, I think, shows you something of the ramshackle nature of French trenches.
Their idea of a trench was a temporary staging post from which they would launch an attack and drive the Germans back. So they did not look at trenches as a kind of permanent, well-made place in which to live. It was a temporary place that they wanted to leave and then dig another trench further on, hopefully.
For the moment, though, the trenches offered a temporary respite from German bullets and the terrifying uncertainties of no man's land.
What's interesting about this picture, I think, it's a very subjective and full of dark fear. The rest of the pictures don't have that. It's all about implication. I think that's why it's a psychological picture, because it's about this idea that at any moment, great violence could be meted upon you across this field. Something could come at you.
In the spring of 1915, the French made the first of a series of attempts to break through the German lines, with campaigns in Artois and Champagne. It was impossible to outflank the enemy. The only option was to go right through them. But the Germans had better weapons and more of them.
At the start of the war, the General Staff didn't think machine guns counted for very much, and they were reduced to 2 per battalion of a rather unreliable machine gun.
The machine gun in this picture is indicative of the desperate attempts to get more equipment, and very often having to fall back on what weren't necessarily ideal types of weapon in order to plug the gaps, the desperate situation France found itself in after it was invaded in 1914.
Machine guns were effective. Surprisingly, though, the machine gun wasn't the biggest casualty producer of the war. What killed you, or what crippled you, or what drove you insane was the shell. What often happened was that machine guns made you take cover, and once you'd taken cover, the shell killed you. And it was the feeling of caprice that came with the shell, that all your courage and piety and wit made no difference. The advantage was with the shell, and you had no comeback.
The ace in the French pack was the 75mm field gun.
It was a magnificent gun. It was one of the great classic guns in the history of artillery throughout the ages. One of its great features was that its recoil didn't shake it from its firing position, so you didn't have to relocate it, re-sight it, each time you fired.
Initially, the French army had so few effective artillery pieces that they were forced to use this mobile field gun in unintended ways. Pictures in the Kahn archive show it dug in, adapted as an anti-aircraft gun, and modified for long-range use. By contrast, the Germans had a wide range of cannons and specially designed trench mortars, which inflicted huge casualties on French troops.
There was a massive high explosive injury. Grenades, trench mortars, howitzers and artillery, and shrapnel bursts, which destroyed men. So men's bodies were actually ripped apart by explosive devices, throwing into the wounds bits of infected and dirty clothing, the shrapnel, the fragments of shell and bullets, and of course the soil.
Injuries could be horrific, and initially medical treatment was haphazard.
In the early part of the war, your chances of survival, if wounded, were low. The French Army Medical Service took a long time to get together, and they had a crazy idea that you had to be treated in a hospital near where you joined up. So soldiers who were shot in the north of France had to be treated in the south, and that meant a 12-hour train ride. It was a chaotic system. The longer the war went on, the better the care got.
Eventually, the French army did develop a relatively well-organized medical service. There were specially trained chiens sanitaires to sniff out injured men. The seriously wounded were relayed to military hospitals behind the lines. These extraordinary pictures were taken at a military hospital in the Loiret in 1915.
There was a desire to learn by surgeons how could they best treat these wounds. Now, it looks to me as though these photographs are taken exactly for that instructional purpose. They're trying to show how wounds heal if you adopt certain procedures. The faces, the faces of resignation, aren't they? And of sort of gritting my teeth. I've got to get on with this. You don't know whether they're gritting their teeth because they're being photographed, or gritting their teeth because the wound's still sore.
This photograph shows the devastating after effects of a shrapnel wound.
Here we have fragments of dead bone that have been removed, and they're sort of displayed like successful trophies beside the patient. It illustrates a common problem of warfare, which is chronic bone infection. And what actually happens is that a long bone or some bone in the body is broken, dirt is driven in, bacteria are driven into the wound, and bone gets infected. But it only takes 2 or 3 tiny fragments to keep that wound open. And the bone will not only not heal, but it won't unite. And using forceps such as these, which are fairly strong forceps from the First War, one would reach in to remove all the dead bits of bone. A process such as this would go on for months or years often.
By the end of 1915, France had mobilized over 15,000 doctors. For the military surgeons and nurses, the sheer volume of wounded men was almost overwhelming. Hospitals became medical laboratories where doctors tried out new surgical techniques. This remarkable image shows a bizarre experiment which took place at a hospital in the Aisne. It features 2 wounded men who've been sewn together at the knee.
I find this photo something quite extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it before. The man on the left, who's had the severe knee injury, clearly has had surgery. There's a red rubber drain inserted into the inside aspect of the knee joint, and opposed and sutured to it is the amputated stump of the opposite man's leg. In other words, it's a form of bringing fresh tissue into a wound that won't heal. And they would have had to have kept extremely still for any chance of healing at all. And it would have been almost unbearable. I mean, imagine trying to change the sheets in that bed, or having an itch somewhere and not being able to shift. One wonders just how long these men could keep it up. I think it probably didn't work, but at least it shows us that these doctors were trying desperately to bring healing to these wounds and, you know, infection that's just almost impossible to get rid of sometimes without losing the limb.
By the end of 1915, 350,000 French soldiers were dead or missing, and a further 500,000 had been wounded. Neither side had made a decisive breakthrough, so it was now obvious that this was going to be a long, drawn-out war. For most of the soldiers, episodes of intense and potentially fatal action were punctuated by prolonged stretches of tedium. These photographs were taken in Compiègne Woods in 1915, just a few miles from the front line. It's a scene more reminiscent of a holiday camp than a military barracks. Behind the lens was Stéphane Passé, one of Kahn's most experienced photographers.
Stéphane Passé was a man with a really good eye, as they say. The way in which he composed pictures was very aesthetic, and it's clear the soldiers felt relaxed with him. There's no obvious posed setup of the kind you see in propaganda pictures. This way of recording life was typical of the archives of the planet.
The hut itself sort of reminds me of the kinds of things perhaps that the colour photographers themselves were expecting to find in Africa or Asia. Typical tribal kinds of structures, temporary, fragile structures. But obviously this kind of thing is very typical for French peasantry. And we have to bear in mind that many of these soldiers, the majority of these soldiers, were French peasants in uniform. And so you're getting images of a kind of medieval French countryside peasant life.
Kahn's photographers were interested in every aspect of army life. Here's a group of French soldiers peeling carrots. Here they're washing their smalls. And here's a soldier testing out the latest in camouflaged urinals.
These are photographs of great affection and of enduring solidarity with the men in uniform. They're also filled with anger because these people could be doing so many other creative things instead of hurling metal across the lines to kill people just like them. There's an anger in them. Nobody in those photographs wanted this war. Nobody caused it, but all of them are suffering it.
This is a group of French soldiers on maneuvers in 1915.
It sounds rather banal, trite thing to say, but that is so French a picture. A group of British soldiers wouldn't look quite like that.
It's quite a sweet picture, and they look so ramshackle. It's not one of them's wearing the same uniform as the next one, and it's hardly, propagates the image of the modern army on the way to war with, its best soldiers and its best technology. I mean, they look like a rabble. They look like a tinkers or something.
During the war, British soldiers always assumed that the French were well fed, but in fact, their army rations couldn't be relied on.
When the French soldier could get it, he wasn't fed too badly, but too often, particularly in difficult times, under fire, in winter, he would be reduced to one meal a day with things arriving cold. He had a hard time.
This autochrome of a solitary cyclist enjoying his lunch is now considered one of the iconic images of the Kahn collection.
This man is a cyclist orderly. He's been taking a message from A to B, and the time has come on for him to have some lunch. So he's leant his bike up against something in a village square, and there he is, getting tucked in, and he's having some bread and probably some cheese.
He looks so human. His military equipment is behind him, and what is important to him is a piece of bread.
The soldier doesn't seem to be very conscious of the camera. It's a private moment. This guy's he's just getting on with it, he's having his lunch, he's not emptying a cannon or polishing his rifle or something, he's just having his lunch. The background's quite interesting too. Why is the town so empty? And all the windows are shuttered, and those that aren't are smashed. Like so many of the pictures, you kind of think, where are we with this? Because I'm so used to seeing trenches and mud and all that kind of Wilfred Owen approach to the First World War. When you look at these pictures, you just think, where is this now,
Many soldiers killed time making souvenirs, so-called trench art. A used shell case could become an ashtray, or a vase, or 24 rings.
Some soldiers made it because they were bored and they just wanted to sell it to make money. Others would exchange it with other soldiers in a barter system, which they had on the Western Front in particular. And others would send them home as objects for the family, souvenirs for wives, girlfriends, parents, as a kind of embodiment of their experience of war. The fact that they were making objects of remembrance and peace out of the most appalling items made originally to kill and maim people is just one of the great ironies of the First World War.
Soldiers also made more ephemeral works of art. This handcrafted frieze was photographed in 1915 in northern France.
What we have here is a farm building with a very thin layer of plaster, onto which soldiers have either put more plaster or mud and sculpted it into three-dimensional images. It's extremely interesting, not only from the point of view I've never seen anything quite like it, but of course also it's in colour. So you get this almost sense of smell of the mud and the plaster coming out of these images of Kaiser Wilhelm and a German and a pig and all of these French caricatures of German soldiers and the military hierarchy.
Behind the lines, soldiers had access to the national press, but their own self-produced newspapers were often the most popular.
They're filled with in-jokes, all kinds of humorous asides. They are creating a cultural world of their own. And that world of soldiers is powerful, extraordinarily deep. The bonding between French soldiers in the First World War is part of the reason why they prevailed, part of the reason why they survived. They brought pre-war culture with them and then adapted it to their own needs.
Regular postal services were also intended to raise spirits. But for many soldiers, it wasn't easy to put pen to paper.
I mean, how do you tell the person you love the most in the whole world that you've had your greatcoat spattered with your best friend's brains? How do you describe glistening lengths of entrails about the war in no man's land? And very often, although the mail was important, although communication with home was important, soldiers felt that the only people who really understood that were people who, like them, had shared the experience.
In order to combat these feelings of alienation, an officially sanctioned pen friend system paired lonely soldiers with women who were sympathetic to their plight.
Women could adopt a French soldier. They were called a marins de guerre. The soldier on leave would go and stay with the lady concerned. Occasionally it led to marriage. But it provided the French soldier with what he badly needed, a sense that somebody was interested in him. Letters from home too often seemed to be concerned with local things and relatives simply not understanding what life was like in the trenches. And these marins de guerre, women who did understand and were prepared to take an interest in the individual soldier, were important.
In 1916, the war reached a new peak of intensity, with major battles all along the front. The British faced their toughest test so far at the Somme. For the French, the defining battle of the war took place at a small town close to their northeastern border, Verdun. Today, this elegant, sleepy town on the banks of the Meuse is as calm and quiet as the river which flows through it. But in 1916, it was subjected to sustained attack by the full weight of the German army.
Verdun is the most exposed point on the French frontier after September 1914. It was half encircled by the nature of the German positions around it. It was not easily supplied by the French. Things were therefore stacked up in Germany's favour.
By January 1916, the Germans had amassed 1 million troops to take on Verdun. On the French side, there were just 200,000 men. On the 21st of February, the Germans launched the biggest attack of the war so far.
The Germans thought that by a process of attrition, endless attacks on Verdun, they could wear down the French army to a point where its will to fight would collapse, or alternatively they could break through.
1,400 German guns fired 100,000 shells per hour into Verdun and its surrounding forts. Before long, the city was in ruins. The industrial-scale carnage of battles like Verdun was particularly appalling for pacifist Albert Kahn.
Kahn's reaction is one of hopes destroyed. And there enters into his work and to some of his writing a sense of anger, a sense of outrage at the peace torn up, the hopes of millions of people destroyed.
In his manifesto on the rights and responsibilities of government, he revealed his horror at the continuing slaughter.
Future generations will ask in astonishment how a catastrophe such as this could befall us. How could it have happened? How could such a great portion of the wealth of the earth be destroyed? How could the entire world be enveloped in a huge net of lies, corruption, and treachery without anyone foreseeing it? Future generations will never forgive us if no effort is made to avoid such a disaster happening again.
This text is interesting because the patriotic feeling in it is very strong. He expresses the righteous anger of a man who could see his countrymen being murdered in the war. But he still has the desire to reconcile with the current enemy one day, so the ambition to promote peace remains within him.
The Battle of Verdun ground on for months. It was the ultimate war of attrition. Both armies expending huge amounts of manpower, taking and retaking each other's positions.
I think the Germans were surprised by the strength of French resistance. And by the end of this battle, fresh German units coming up the valley of the Meuse to go into the mincing machine on these heights took to bleating. They felt that they were sheep being led into the slaughter.
The battle became a symbolic battle, the Battle of France itself, during the combat, during the struggle. And that was, perhaps it would have been possible to abandon Verdun at the beginning of the battle, but after 3 months or 5 months of struggle, after so many losses in both camps, it became absolutely impossible to retreat from such a front.
Both the French and the German armies suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. The only winners were the munitions manufacturers and the carrion crows. As the war went on, France increasingly turned to its colonies to make up for its losses. 130,000 troops were recruited in Central Africa, 50,000 in Indochina. The most feared colonial troops were the elite regiments such as the Zouaves, who were mainly recruited from among the French settlers in Algeria and Tunisia.
Zouaves were regarded at the beginning of the war as being amongst the best troops in the French army. Troops like this, colonial troops, North African troops, were very, very good indeed. The Zouaves were famous for their hard-living lifestyle. They drank a lot, and they often sported spectacular tattoos. So here's a Zouave, hard man, pied noir from North Africa. And although he's been appallingly wounded, he's still quite a regimental soldier, and he's got a moustache, but it's the twirled-end moustache. He's got his checha, and the checha is the typical Zouave headdress. It's sort of like a sort of fez, but worn on the back of the head. So here you have a Zouave who's been hard hit. And in a way, the face says it all, doesn't it? This is a proud man.
France's West African territories also provided thousands of troops. Though many came from Mali and Guinea, they were collectively known as tirailleurs sénégalais, Senegalese riflemen.
France used propaganda in order to recruit them, promising them reward, promising them money, adventure, if they leave their village and go to Europe. So you have a lot of people attracted by the French propaganda. But above all, force, was used to recruit soldiers. The French administration in West Africa relied on the African chiefs to recruit these soldiers. In countries like Guinea, for instance, volunteers were chained, and brought to the colonial officers and then sent to Europe.
One of the most enthusiastic promoters of African troops was Charles Mangin, a battle-hardened former colonial officer who was nicknamed the Butcher by his long-suffering men.
Even before the war, General Mangin had said that France should recruit a large black army, and his voice was increasingly heard as the manpower situation worsened.
General Mangin developed the idea that African soldiers were good soldiers because they lack intelligence, because they lack brains. And if you lack brains, then you're less likely to suffer from pain, or you suffer less from fear. This is the kind of racist cliché that support, the massive recruitment of West Africans during the First World War.
Once they reached France, the black African soldiers were quickly sent into action, much to the consternation of the Germans.
The Germans thought this was something that ought not to happen, that the French were shocking to put black soldiers in the field.
While German propaganda condemned France as uncivilized for using African troops, the French were happy to exploit the idea that their African soldiers were particularly vicious.
There is a long history actually here, and if you go back to, for instance, the colonial time of the colonial conquest in the 19th century, the French used this image to legitimate the colonial project, saying that Africans are vicious, that African kings are brutes. And during the First World War, they are using the same kind of image to scare their enemy, the Germans. If you look at the weapons, the only different weapon is this machete. This long knife, supposedly typical of, Africa, of the savage. It's a real weapon, true, they can use this weapon, but it's much more efficient as a psychological weapon, as a way to impress your opponent. So in this picture, I think that he's playing the role he has been asked to play by the French army. But for me, as an historian, I would say that the more interesting picture is the one depicting the tirailleurs Senegalais simply washing their clothes. Because in this picture, you simply have human beings fighting during the war, having to survive during the war. Of course, because of the racism, they probably suffered more than other troops. They were also fighting in a country that never recognized them. But what is interesting in this picture is that on a daily basis, they were soldiers like any other soldier in the French army.
By 1917, there was still no end in sight to the war, in spite of all the new weapons being developed by both sides. Tanks first used by the British at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Flamethrowers, a favourite weapon of German stormtroopers. And big guns, the ultimate symbol of military power. At the beginning of the war, the French army lagged far behind the Germans in this respect. But by the time these photographs were taken, in the summer of 1917, the French were catching up fast. Meet Cyclone, a French 340mm gun. It could lob a ton of high explosives over 20 miles.
Even though Albert Kahn was a pacifist, his photographers brought back these pictures of cannons, of killing machines. He was fascinated at that time to see what industry, modernity and science were capable of producing. He wanted to see the biggest, the most effective, the most modern weapons. And, in a sense, it was another way of admiring the advances in modernity.
Of all the technologies of the First World War, the one that would have the most significant long-term impact was military aviation.
This is a Farman airplane, and it's one of the first planes to be used in the war. It was used for reconnaissance. It became obsolete very quickly because it was so vulnerable to attack from enemy fighters. At the start of the war, the pilots and people who flew in these planes weren't armed. They sometimes had a revolver or a small rifle, but they weren't really prepared for aerial combat.
Gradually, permanent guns were attached to military planes as they took on new and more aggressive roles.
In order to deny the enemy observation, fighters were developed. They would try to clear the enemy's reconnaissance aircraft from the battlefield so that he couldn't give directions to his artillery.
Initially, a lot of French pilots were former cavalrymen who'd swapped their horses for planes.
On a ici une photographie qui est tragique.
This is a tragic picture, and it clearly shows how cruel the air war was.
Ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est que par
The
exemple,
thing you must realize is that French pilots hardly ever had parachutes. They say the French Air Command didn't want to give them parachutes for fear that some pilots might bail out early to avoid getting into dogfights.
Les gens sautent de l'avion sans se battre.
The photographer who took this image would have known that it could never have been published. Perhaps that's why he allowed his shadow to intrude into the picture.
In fact, we know that pictures of French bodies were censored during the war. They couldn't show any sort of weakness in the army or amongst the troops. But we do have some photos, because death was part of daily life. And to take a picture of a dead Frenchman is also a way of bearing witness to what was happening on a daily basis.
Increasingly, as the war went on, aircraft were used for bombing raids. Not that there was that much left to blow up. By the middle of 1917, much of northern France lay in waste. Villages wiped off the map, landscapes devastated. The bright green of the French countryside blasted into monochrome.
It really did look as though it was a part of hell. What had been pleasant agricultural land with trees, farmhouses, little country lanes, totally transformed into ruined buildings, stumps of trees, and a general grey mass of total destruction.
Photographers themselves were fascinated by such landscape, you know. That never happened before, because artillery was not powerful enough before to create such landscapes. Many soldiers told about this horrible landscape, you know, with no color at all except gray, and no sounds too, you know, no birds, no animals, nothing at all. That was extremely traumatizing.
In March 1917, the Germans withdrew northwards to a new set of defensive positions, the Hindenburg Line. They left behind a trail of destruction and warnings for their pursuers. This reads, "May God punish England."
The deliberate destruction of farm buildings, the poisoning of wells, and the killing of cattle, this deeply shocked the French soldier. Until that, the French soldier had, by and large, treated the captive German soldier quite well. But French peasant soldiers who saw this were shocked.
The war was also taking a heavy psychological toll on the French army. The citizen soldiers who cheerfully marched off to fight in August 1914 were now a battle-weary, bedraggled force. By the spring of 1917, over 800,000 men had been killed, and millions more were maimed for life. So, after yet another series of failed offensives, in May 1917, the French army mutinied.
The French army, it was like a beast of burden which had had too much to bear. It simply said, enough. We're fed up with bad food, poor wine, leave trains that go nowhere. We're fed up with munitions workers that get paid infinitely better than we do. We're not going to do any more of these lunatic offensives. You want to do the offensives, you do, we're not.
It's a strike. It's a strike, a military strike, in which soldiers think that they have rights and that officers, headquarters, have to respect their rights as citizens. And when General Pétain makes them understand that these rights would be respected in the future, that's the end of the mutinies.
After 2 months, most of the rebellions had ended. The High Command improved food, leave provision, and the daily wine ration. But most importantly, they promised not to order any further major offensives until reinforcements arrived. Fortunately, help was at hand. The United States had declared war on Germany in April 1917. During the course of the year, American troops started to arrive in Europe.
American troops arrived in France in 1917, knew nothing about the war. They had that time-honored view that Americans can solve the problems that Europeans create for themselves. They're taller than anybody else. They have a bit more swagger. Their presence indicated something about a breath of fresh air and an injection of fresh blood and muscle when the French army had been beaten. It was not going to attack the Germans again, and that meant the German army would remain on French soil.
In the spring of 1918, the Germans staged a last major offensive, Operation Michael. Their aim was to drive a wedge between the British and French armies before sufficient numbers of Americans arrived. Initially, the Germans were successful and came within artillery range of Paris before the Allied armies drove them back. By the summer, hundreds of thousands of Americans were arriving every month, and the Germans were surrendering in droves. When the end came, it happened more quickly than anyone expected. In early November 1918, the two sides met in a railway carriage in the middle of the Compiègne forest. A deal was finally struck at dawn on the 11th of November. And a few hours later, at 11 o'clock, the guns fell silent. With news of the armistice, all over France there were scenes of mass rejoicing. For the Americans, the war had been mercifully short. But for the French and their British allies, it had been long, cruel, and bloody.
The French army celebrated the end of the war on the 11th of November, but it was a peace that had a taste as of ashes in it. There were a few days of getting drunk in Paris and elsewhere. But after the headaches wore off, the sheer weight of loss of life in war meant triumphalism could not be expressed in 1918.
The war was won, but at enormous cost. France had lost more men than any of the other combatants, a horrifying total of 1.3 million dead.
Roughly a third of Frenchmen under 30 had been killed or crippled in the war. And one of the things that the war does is strips the generation of the 20s and 30s of its joie de vivre. That's a dreadful suffering which for me has almost burnt itself onto this landscape.
The Kahn archive holds by far the largest number of colour images of the First World War. What had begun as an interruption to Kahn's mission to document the world became a unique collection in its own right, a powerfully intimate and humane portrait of the French soldier at war. For thousands of men, these images are their last testament, flesh and blood captured in vivid colour, lives as fragile as the glass plates on which they were recorded.